All right, good evening.
Good evening.
So yeah, we have a nice little intimate group. That's what I always like to say. It's not a small group, it's just an intimate group. A few of our standard big talkers, I won't mention any names, but they're out tonight. So everyone has, more of an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. We should have a pretty good week. We're kind of doing 2 chapters. Kind of. You'll understand when we get to chapter 5. We're going to be in the book a little bit tonight, so keep that handy. We'll be starting in Genesis 4. So last week, we talked about the fall. We talked about the nature of good and evil. And where we left the story last week, it was, sin had come into the world. Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. But we're left with the hope that we ended on discussing last week. The prophecy of one who would crush the head of the serpent. So this week, we're going to talk about Cain and Able and the genealogies that take place afterwards. And that's why I said sort of 2 chapters, because we're not going to read a straight chapter of so-and-so begat so-and-so. We'll just do a couple highlights there. But why don't we open up in prayer and we can dig in. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for those who are able to make it out. We just pray that you be with us during this brief time, that as we study your word, we would understand you better, understand your truth. Just pray you be with us in that and help us to see what you have for us. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, basic opening questions. So last week, Adam and Eve were exiled. They're no longer in the garden. If you are one of those 2, what are the first things you're doing to try to survive?
A house.
Oh, so you're just building a whole house, day one.
Yeah, shelter.
Okay, shelter. Food. Okay.
Do they have fire?
Water.
That's a good question. Did they have fire? I don't know. Yeah, food, water, shelter, pretty basic. There was a lot of rivers around, so that was helpful. Okay. If you had to choose, would you rather be a shepherd or a farmer? If you're unfamiliar with the story of Cain and Able, this seems out of left field. Shepherd? Okay. How come?
God accepted his gifts.
Oh, okay. See, Patrick read ahead. He's going straight for the theological stuff. Okay. Anyone else? Seems like most of us don't want to be either.
Gardening, I guess, or farming.
Farming? Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure either. They both seem to have their downsides.
And upsides.
Yeah.
I would say shepherd because it would seem easier, but then I thought about having to defend against wild animals and thought, well, no, maybe it'll be better to be a farmer.
Yeah, you just need to defend against like pests and
But
stuff.
that's also hard.
Yeah. If you were a shepherd, you could practice your songwriting skills and your slingshot abilities.
If you're a farmer, you got to farm the ground that's cursed.
Yeah. Oh, that's what we're dealing with now, so,
Now this is, we're not up to the part where it says God put the fear of man in the animals yet, but
Correct.
is that to be assumed that that's already happened since they're out, or is that coming a little late?
That's a good question. So I would think it's probably an assumed thing. Like, I don't know that.
Somebody don't do it, and they can come back.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's Genesis 9 when Noah gets off the ark that God makes that formal declaration.
Not too far back.
However, you might be right. I don't know that we're meant to think that the relationship with animals is completely the same as it was in the garden. Because there's also like some level of animal sacrifice now. So something is different. But we'll get to it with Noah. There's sort of a new, like a twist on that initial mandate thing going on as Noah kind of steps into the new world that's made. Yeah, I would assume the relationship has changed, but it's not clear in the text. Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into Genesis chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 through 12 to start, and then I'll get your thoughts. All right, Genesis 4, verse 1. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And we're going to leave it there for now. We'll get to Cain's response later. But what are your opening thoughts with this section of the text? What jumps out at you, or what do you find interesting? Before what?
Before this offering.
Okay. So you're assuming, like, this isn't the first time they've done
Well,
this.
it's because it says process of time. Yeah, it was a process of time. So it just seems like that he knew better.
Yeah.
He just chose not to.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, that's one of the interesting things with this chapter is that, like you said, there's no Mosaic law that's written yet. There's no clear structure of, here's what you offer, here's how and when, that we know of. Like we were saying earlier, clearly God expected that Cain knew, what was going on. But we don't really know exactly what it is. It seems like some sort of free will offering, but yeah, we really don't have the specifics of it, which is interesting. But also interesting that in the first generation outside the garden, they're doing sacrifices. That's interesting.
Well, but didn't God sacrifice on their behalf? So I'm assuming that he would have set that up as a practice for that reason.
Right.
And I would assume that Adam would teach the boys what to do. Because it doesn't seem like they're young kids at this point.
Right. Yeah, we don't really get an age, but you always kind of assume they're older.
Right. Because then their father would still be doing the sacrifice for them.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, because we were saying last week that the idea of sacrifice is implied as God gives Adam and Eve like skin coats, like, I don't know, fur coat, I don't know what it looked like. When I say fur coat, I have a ridiculous image in my head of like a, wealthy, like extravagant woman, that's probably not it, but, probably something from an animal. So some animal died to cover their sin, and then that kind of starts the cycle of the idea of sacrifice that gets played out here. Okay, so in your workbook, top of page 22. We'll have a few quotes from the workbook tonight. All right, top of page 22, paragraph starts with, the first child to be born in the world was born with an inherited sin nature. Nevertheless, it must have been a happy day when Eve delivered a baby boy. She named him Cain, meaning acquisition or gotten. Obviously, she believed he was a gift from God. Adam and Eve's second baby was also a boy, but he would become a far different man than his older brother. His name, Able, means breath or vanity. We'll talk about that. The name suggests that Adam and Eve often pondered the tragic consequences of sin in the garden. Life had become temporal. It was passing as quickly as a breath of air. Whether that's why they named him Able, I have no idea. I wanted to do a little bit on their names. So Cain has a little bit of double wordplay going on. So Eve says, she named him Cain because I've gotten a male child from the Lord. So the word is very, the name Cain means something like gotten or procured, like the book said. But there's wordplay going on in the Hebrew because the word also is very similar to something like striking, like with a spear or lance. So there's a military term in there, a violent term in there. Now, Able, they said, the book said that his name means something like, what did they say, breath or vanity. So if you're familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, that whole thing. So oddly enough, it's the same word. So Abel's name is, I never put the two together because I was doing it, reading Ecclesiastes recently for a month. And the word that gets translated vanity is the Hebrew word hevel, which means something like smoke or vapor. And the idea is smoke. It's here and it's gone. And the author of Ecclesiastes is everything is hevel. It's like chasing the wind. You can't grasp onto it. It's here, it's gone, it's transient. And that's actually what Abel's name is. I did not realize that. That's pretty interesting. So you have one son that is named, has wordplay that's kind of going on with this violent nature, and another one who is here and gone. And that is how it plays out. So Eve is, of course, very excited at the birth of her firstborn son, the first child born in creation. And also, not only is it oh, great, you had a kid, she's happy, cool. But we talked about with the prophecy, the promise in Genesis 3:15 of the one who would crush the head of the serpent, all Eve knows is someone from the seed of the woman is going to come and crush the head of the serpent. So she has her first kid, and there's this idea of oh, great. We've gotten a child from the Lord. Maybe this is going to be the one to crush the head of the serpent. It's very, very early on in what they know about God's unfolding plan for this. So, yeah, it is interesting. Even just, we really haven't gotten out of verse 1. As Eve is excited about this child, maybe he's this snake crusher. Of course, we also play into what we know happened last week, which is that sorrow in childbearing. And we talked in detail about that last week. And that's exactly what's about to play out, so Eve's hopeful, but there's this looming curse because the thing that should have been the good, holy, God-given thing of being fruitful and multiplying is going to end in disaster. If you still have your workbook open, you can look at page, about the middle of page 22. There's a paragraph that starts with, Cain became a farmer, apparently a very productive one. Knowing that he should worship God, he harvested some vegetables and presented them to the Lord as an offering. Apparently, he should have understood that only blood sacrifice would be acceptable to God. After all, his parents had learned this truth in Eden and had surely taught him. Nevertheless, Cain wanted God to accept him on his terms. His pride kept him from going to God on God's terms. Cain was the first to reject the truth that without shedding blood, there is no remission of sin. Hebrews 9:22. Okay, so throwing it out to you guys a little bit, the book hints a little bit, but in your mind, when you read this story, what's wrong with Cain's sacrifice primarily,
It wasn't a blood sacrifice. He didn't sacrifice an animal.
Yeah.
It'd have to be the first fruits, because if he's a farmer, if he just was raised, plants,
Yeah.
he would have had at least go to his brother to get maybe
Right.
a firstborn, or have to go out and try to find something out in the wilderness to kill an animal for sacrifice.
Right.
I don't know if it had to be a first one or just a blood sacrifice.
Right. Yeah, see, you're finding that's the trick, that's the ambiguity here, because we have no idea what God required of them in this moment. Now, I think we have good reason to believe, you can easily go with, it should have been a blood sacrifice, because that's what we see first in Eden. Of course, even in the law of Moses, there are certain sacrifices where, there are grain offerings, there are, different things like that. Things where you bring bread or money. We just heard a sermon, Sunday school lessons from pastor about, the widow's mite. So people just gave offerings, money offerings to the temple. So there's all sorts of things that can be done. I think you can make a good case for the blood sacrifice. But a thing that is pointed out that you're hitting on is it specifically says that Abel gave says the firstling, that's an odd term to us, but he gave the first produce of his flock, so if you don't know a lot about shepherds or, keeping sheep, they have a season, just like farmers do, which is weird, there's a harvest season, so sheep tend to give birth at a certain time of the year, and the idea of giving to God your first and your best, so we do know that Abel did that. We have nothing that indicates Cain doing that. So it could be Cain just wasn't giving his first fruits. He wasn't sacrificing, his best, his first, could have been scrap leftovers, and God wasn't happy with this. But we really don't know. I probably lean towards blood sacrifice, but I the logic it's not fully formed for us to be able to know what God actually told them, you know. Verse 6. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? Why is thy countenance fallen? To you guys, did God not know?
It was a rhetorical question.
Rhetorical question. Who would ask a rhetorical question?
A parent. Or a teacher.
Yeah. And of course, this comes up later after he kills his brother. You get this another, hey, where's your brother? I haven't seen him around in a bit, that kind of thing. And it echoes how God dealt with Adam and Eve. He calls out, Adam, where are you? And God interacts with them in extremely, can I say, human ways? Like, he's not acting from, of course God knows where they are, but he still interacts he condescends to their level and interacts with them through some sort of speech communication and actually gives them a chance to discuss this with him, which is, I think we're probably all familiar with these stories. So it's like, oh yeah, no, of course, God just came down and asked Cain why he wasn't in a good mood. And you're like, wait, what's going on? So it's pretty crazy, but God is condescending to him in a unique way and very, very obvious close relationship with the earliest people. So verse 7. So, okay. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. Now, we're going to discuss the second half of the phrase, the second half of the verse. Unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. But first, so when it says sin lies at the door, it means lies in the sense of like someone lying in wait. Like, so you could, a lot of modern translations will make that like sin is crouching or lurking. The English word lies is correct, but if you're thinking like laying down, not laying down, like lying in wait. But it's really like an animalistic term. So yeah, it's like sin is crouching at the door, waiting for him. And if I didn't want to bring it up till this week, we could have mentioned it last week, or whenever we discussed the fall. So in chapters 3 and 4, you get this image of like, okay, Adam and Eve's initial purpose, one of the big things they're doing, they will rule the earth, subdue it, and they have authority over all the animals, every beast of the field, fish, fowl, whole thing. They're supposed to be the ones ruling over creation on God's behalf. And then what does Eve get deceived by? It's an animal, and we have discussed exactly what it is, but she allows an animal to be the one in control, the serpent. And then in this scenario, Cain has two options. He can do what he knows is right, or, you do anything else. This thing called sin is, it's crouching, it's lying in wait, it's like ready to attack. And it's this other animalistic term that's being used. So there's sort of like a level of abstraction going on where you're getting a level away from what happened in Eden, but it's still this idea that if he doesn't follow God in this, he's letting, again, like that, the animal take control. He's not ruling over the thing he's supposed to be ruling over. And by doing that, you're kind of blurring a lot of interesting lines of like, the actual animal, the serpent, represented the sinful choice in the garden, and now it's like, oh, ruling over the animals, you're also supposed to be ruling over the lower things, sin being one of them. So there's a little bit of parallelism, I guess, going on there. They end up being ruled by the serpent, and here sin is shown as a creature. The second half of the verse, it's a fine translation, it's a confusing translation. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. I understand what they're doing in the translation. I think it's just a little tricky for us. So a lot of translations would make this something like, talking about sin crouching at the door, that sin's desire will be to rule over Cain, but Cain needs to rule over sin, like he needs to master sin. There's an inherent ambiguity in the Hebrew with thou shalt rule over. So it's kind of like thou, you, Cain, you rule over sin in the Hebrew, and then you kind of have to supply what you think it's meaning. So it could be like you shall or you must. And I think what the King James is doing is linking, unto thee, unto you, Cain, shall be sin's desire. Like, okay, so sin wants to take you. That creature crouching at the door, sin, wants to devour Cain. And the idea of, I think they're linking the last phrase to the first. Like, if you do well, thou shalt rule over sin. I think that's the translational choice they're making. I think it just becomes a little tricky. They're making a slightly different choice in a lot of modern translations, but I think it gets the point across either way. So if this is just baffling you, go on Bible Gateway and look it up in something else, that's okay. Verses 9 and 10. The Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. What do you think of Cain's response here? Is this how you would typically think to speak to God? Very flippant. Especially after you just killed a guy.
Well, but it's the same with when he asked him about why is your countenance fallen. I think that shows that the sin is crept in. So when God says, where's your brother? It's kind of like, well, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
Which is dangerous, but like,
yeah. Yeah.
He kind of gives almost a similar response to his parents, where it's like, they didn't want to be responsible for, it was just kind of like blaming, like not taking responsibility.
Yeah.
Like, almost like, why should I look out for my family members kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, so verse 11 is interesting. We weren't in verse 11, but so we have another curse in verse 11, specific to Cain, but we already had, so like you're watching the Adam and Eve situation just repeat all throughout the chapter. You're watching similar stories play out, binary choices to follow God's wisdom or sin in some animalistic form. And then you get a curse. So now thou art cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy blood, thy brother's blood from thy hand. This is one of the first indications of, I guess it's the second, but so the idea that the earth and the land is affected by human sin. Okay, so like you obviously get the initial sin curse, you know. Okay, so Adam and Eve sin, and there's repercussions for earth as the thing under Adam's domain. This idea, like, it's kind of this picture of the earth, you know, opening its mouth, whatever that means, to like kind of drink in the blood of Abel. It's a very dark picture. But later, especially as you're dealing with like nations, there's this idea that violence like pollutes a land. That this happens a lot, especially as God is judging other nations, and Israel, because there's a lot of like injustice later with when some of the prophets are preaching against Israel. This idea of like sin has a polluting effect, which is very interesting. That's why, you know, every once in a while, you know, when it gets bad enough, God cleanses the land in a host of different ways. Whether it's like the flood that we'll see, or, you know, even when Babylon comes to destroy Judah, Jeremiah often presents it in like flood language, like kind of calling back to that cleansing and washing of the land because of its like sin and injustice. And this is just an interesting kind of like opening salvo of this image that will be carried throughout much of the Old Testament. Okay, so...
And then there's Christ saying, you know, like that Christ is the sacrifice.
Right.
So it's a very different meaning. Have I misunderstood it?
No, so I think it's all more similar than you're thinking. Maybe because the imagery of it changes a bit. And I'll tell you right off the bat, we don't know what Cain and Able sacrifice is exactly about. Like we said, you know, the law of Moses, there are a bunch of different types of sacrifice. And then Christ ends up fulfilling those sacrifices in the law of Moses. But here we have no information on like what this is. So with the law of Moses, you'll have a sacrifice for you've committed like a serious sinful offense and you need to go and take care of that. But then you have like free will offerings because you're like, you know what, God's been awesome, I'm gonna give something back. And then they're like, you do different things with that sacrifice. So there are a host of meanings to those sacrifices, so we don't know what they're doing here. I think initially, Cain is not sinning. So like he brings the wrong sacrifice. As far as I'm concerned, God doesn't come to him and say, hey, what is this? You're being sinful. Like it's not the right thing, but God comes to him and is like, hey, we know how to make this right. This isn't the right thing. Again, whatever they seem to know about this situation that we don't. So God gives him the opportunity to change it, you know. And then instead he allows himself to get so bent out of shape that God isn't doing things his way instead of him doing things God's way, that he gets bitter and jealous and kills his brother. So like,
I always thought that was kind of the point of sort of his reaction to it.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's the point of that one verse that I had to like discuss about like sin crouching at the door, because God doesn't say that he had sinned before that. It's like, look, if you do the right thing, awesome. If you don't, like, careful. Like, sin lies that way. Like, if you start, once you start defining what is right and wrong on your own, like, same thing with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Once you start doing what you want as opposed to what God wants, like sin is in that direction. You know, sin is kind of waiting for you out there in that wilderness. Yeah, because again, we can only dig so much into the meaning of the sacrifice because there's only so much we're told. You know, we can assume, but yeah, it's more about Cain's reaction and, you know, killing his brother than the sacrifice. That just kind of sets the thing in motion. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Cain's curse was a little different. So verse 12, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength, which is similar to Adam's curse. A fugitive and a vagabond thou shalt be in the earth. Just for the record, I love the word vagabond. It's just such a good, solid old word. What do you think about his penalty? And especially, like we've said, especially, you know, in our introductory lessons, like Genesis is a foundational book. You know, it really sets the tone for a lot of like what it means to be human and what our mission is and what we're supposed to be doing in the world. What do you think of his penalty, especially in that light?
Well, back then, there were safety in numbers,
Yeah.
but also too, that was his chosen field, and I don't know how he chose what he was gonna do. But if you're telling him that he can't grow what he would expect,
Yeah.
but also as a vagabond, you don't have the seasons.
Yeah.
You can't like plow the field, you can't, you know, reap what you sow in a sense.
Yeah.
So it's probably a little bit more,
Kind of uproots him a little bit.
yeah, it's a little bit like, if somebody told me, you know, I couldn't plow a field, I would be, okay, you know, but this was this is what he did.
Right.
So, I think it might seem more harsh back then than it does now.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that mean you have to depend on others?
That's true.
Or I mean, if we can't grow, you have to depend on others to grow it, so we can take out.
Yeah, I don't know if he was supposed to become like hunter-gatherer at that point. Yeah, like exile is a big deal. Was that us? Was that outside?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Okay. In my mind, that was like the outside wall, and I'm like, what is going on? Okay, cool. No problem. Yeah, being in exile in the ancient world is a much bigger deal. Like, we don't really do exile today. That's not really a thing people do anymore. So I know, like, in Norse culture, if, you know, for many different things, you could be exiled. And so imagine yourself in, you know, like Iceland or just the Scandinavian wilderness, which is, you know, winters are almost certain death if you're not in a community with, you know, houses and fires and protection from wolves and bears and things. So, like, if you are cast out of the community, that was a big deal. Also, in a lot of ancient cultures, the idea of the, like, so we're all familiar with the term outlaw, you know, okay, you're outside the law. We tend to think of that as like, oh, you're a lawbreaker. So the Norse had a word for like, if you're a person within our law, like that means you're enabled, you have the protection of our law, you know. No one can steal from you without repercussion, no one can kill you without repercussion, like you're within our realm of justice. But if you committed certain crimes, then you're an outlaw, you're outside our law, which means like people can do just about whatever they want in that culture. You know, if you're exiled, you better move quick.
We don't know how many people were there at the time, so
Yeah.
news would travel fast, because they were always brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews or whatever. So I'm sure they all knew that, you know, you killed your brother.
Yeah.
So they all probably turned his back on it, figuring, okay, well, I'm gonna get food at and
Right.
this They don't say how many people were there at the time, and they put
Right.
that on a long time, so.
Yeah.
At his age, what, he was 100 years old then, or 80 years old.
Right.
He was still a young man, but how many people are there at the time?
Yeah. Yeah, so, to finish that, why don't we roll into the next section of verses, and that'll get to something me and Patrick were talking about at the beginning, because we need to discuss, like, other people in the world. Okay. Start at verse 13, and I will end when it makes sense, because we're going to chop this up a little bit. So, okay, wanderer and vagabond, fugitive and vagabond in the earth. Verse 13, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. The Lord said unto him, therefore whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. And we can leave it there. Okay, so we have. Let's start with this. What do you think of Cain's response?
It seems dramatic. I mean, you killed your brother, but your punishment was too hard for you to bear. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
Everybody's gonna slay me. Like,
Yeah.
how many lives do you have? Or do you think it's just somebody will punch you? I don't know.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think he thinks he's got 9 lives or something, that he's going to be slain multiple times, but yeah.
He wasn't worried about Abel's life when he took it. Now he's
Yeah.
worried about his.
Right. Well, right, and it seems very self-focused.
Right.
There's zero remorse, repentance. It's not like, oh, no, you're right, God, I shouldn't have killed my brother. That's not a good older brother thing to do. It's just all about like, oh, no, this is not going to go well for me, you know.
Well, and even here he says, thou hast driven me out. God didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, he did exile. So,
right, but
yeah.
this is the result of his actions, not because God just decided.
Right. Yeah, notice he's exiled. He goes to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. Okay? So Adam and Eve were already, when they left the Garden of Eden, they went east. And then apparently Cain is going to some land further east. And it's interesting, like exile almost always happens east in the biblical story. So you have Adam and Eve, you have Cain. Eventually, again, the story of Babylon destroying Judah, so much of that is just like the tree of knowledge writ large, because of course they are taken from Judah into captivity to the east, back into Babylon. You know, so like this theme keeps playing out. So God's response here is, you know, it's astonishingly merciful. Okay, so we don't have the regulations in, you know, when Noah gets off the ark, which is when the death penalty is instituted for murder, because you destroyed the image of God. The only just thing, biblically speaking, is for that life to be exchanged for life. So there's no death penalty here, and I think God would have been well within his rights to do that. You know, God's justice, he can do what he wants, and he can have mercy how he wants. But yeah, he doesn't kill him, which you think he could. He's exiled. And he kind of gives credence to Cain's issue of like, oh yeah, you're right, everyone is going to try to kill you. And he sets, this mark upon Cain. Sadly, there is about zero consensus about what the mark of Cain is. Most people who take the Bible literally just say, okay, he had some sort of physical mark that I don't know how people knew, don't kill this guy. And you have to ask why. Because again, like he killed someone. God would have been just to have him killed. So we won't have time this week. I thought we'd get a little further. No, that's always the case. When we'll start looking at the genealogy of Cain eventually, like his descendants, and a lot of people come from it, and like important things come from it. Some good, some very bad. I almost wonder if, as God is deciding how he's going to deal with Cain, he seems to let him go and establish this city Enoch, which is ironic because there's going to be another Enoch who is a very different person, and we'll talk about him. But it seemed to be in the providence of God to allow Cain and his descendants to, also populate the earth, which is kind of what we said with Adam and Eve. Like, even after their sin, God still had them do the human thing, still be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, all that. And even Cain, after his sin, still has the opportunity to do that, in a sense. But we do need to talk about, like we were saying, okay, what do you do with all these extra people? Okay, because Cain is concerned, everyone's going to try to kill me. And then Cain apparently goes into exile with his wife. What do we do with all these extra people?
In what way?
Where do they come from? Where do they go?
Adam and Eve.
Could you elaborate?
Well, they had children, and then the children had children with each other, and then there were more people to choose from to have children with, and it just kept expanding.
Yeah.
Well, it also implies that this is a longer time than 10 years. You know what I mean? Like, because they're established, they talk about a land to the east, Nod. Like,
Yeah.
it has names, so there's a lot of people. I mean, you wonder if God did something so miraculous that they had more offspring than, say, normal,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
And they lived longer, so they could
Yeah.
have children longer.
Yeah. So, again, we don't really have time to dig into the genealogies this week. Next week, we'll get into the incredibly long ages of the early humans. And, okay, so if you have, like, just an avid, devout atheist sitting at the table, they would laugh at my thought process and think that, you just have these really convenient, like, pat answers. This science doesn't support any of this. What I get, and what a lot of people get from early Genesis, is that Adam is almost like Adam and his early descendants seem to be like the pinnacle of what humans should be. Like, and I mean that, like, even physically. Like, they're the first initial creations of God. Some people point to, like, the idea that the sin curse is not, like, that it, in a sense, like, is not as powerful or something like that. I don't know exactly how to gauge something like that. But it's clear So if you take Genesis 5 for what it says, Adam lives like 900 something years. I know that sounds crazy if you're not okay with, just accepting what the Bible says on this. And a lot of his descendants live similar length lives, some a little longer, some a little shorter. And then there comes a definite cutoff where that starts changing. But even some of the main patriarchs who would not have been as long ago, still a long time ago, but like Abraham, like Moses, they're living oddly long lives compared to us, and you're like, okay, I don't know what you want. If you don't take the Bible for what it says, I don't know what you would attribute it to. Because like someone around Moses' time, like if you don't believe any of it and you think it's all just made up stuff, Moses would have lived around like 1400 BC. Someone writing in 1400 BC knows how long people live, like if I was trying to convince you like my grandmother's 143 or like 943, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like people knew how long people lived at the time. So like I just take it for what it says. I think it kind of has to do with something with Adam as like first man, and then I can't get too like scientific with any of it, but it seems like there's a degradation of the human species, like the human genome is just kind of getting more run down in a sense. It's like it doesn't seem to work as well as it did then. That being said, also, you either have to assume that there are a host of other people running around on the planet that the Bible doesn't tell you about in any way, shape, or form, or that you have intermarriage with close relatives that doesn't get overturned until Leviticus, which, there are laws against it that come in Leviticus. And I think it all kind of revolves around that, like, the human was like, it was different. It was functioning better. It was less corrupt, I think, as a physical being in some sense. And it seemed to be a workable condition as humanity is spreading from Adam and Eve. I know that's not it's not an answer that you go like, oh, well, yeah, no, that's cool, that makes sense, that's comfortable. I don't know what to do with it other than what's in the text, Anything with that? Anything we need to go further into? Yeah, when you do some math on like how many children they seemed to have over the longer lifespans, yeah, the population gets out of control quickly. Not out of control, but numbers increase very quickly. Like exponents are a big thing. Yeah, so like
Able may have had children, it doesn't say.
right.
We don't know how old he was when he was murdered, but
Yeah.
it's very possible he could have had children.
Right. Yeah, and that's a lot of the information that we just have no idea about. So we don't get a genealogy from Abel. Doesn't mean he didn't have, like, we just don't know. We have no idea how old either of them were when this took place. We don't even really know if other kids were around. Like, we know Cain and Able.
Well, we know Cain had a wife.
Yeah, okay, good point. So there's someone.
Yeah.
But like you don't know who that is. So that's either like, okay, if you just take the assumption that all humanity is coming from Adam and Eve, logically that is either a sister or like a niece who is still coming from like a brother, sister, like, something like that. But yeah, you have no idea. All we really know, you have Cain, Abel, and some unnamed woman. And you will know, because we'll get to the story of, or the mention of Seth. Seth is born sometime after Abel is murdered. That's what we have, you know. So some people take this. I don't agree, and I think I see why they do it. So some people will say, like, some people who kind of spiritualize early Genesis a little bit, or make it like a bit of a metaphor. They look at something like Cain, you know, Cain and his wife, or, you know, everyone who finds me will try to kill me, and they just say, like, oh, clearly there were other people around, and the Bible has no problem just admitting that because Cain has a wife and there are other people, and like, I don't know that that's the story that's playing out there. Otherwise, you're trying to simplify it. You wildly are complicating what the book of Genesis actually says. So yeah, it's a weird topic, but that's what I have on that. So I was going to, like, we don't have time tonight. It's already a couple minutes past. We'll finish up the story of Cain next week. There's not a ton left to his story, but we're going to look at his genealogy a little bit. We're going to look at the birth of Seth and his genealogy a little bit. We'll look at Enoch. And yeah, because we're kind of jumping in at a weird point, we'll probably start the life of Noah, I would imagine. He kind of comes up quicker than you might think. So yeah, I'm sure there are a whole bunch of weird questions on that. So I'll close in prayer. If you have any questions, we can talk after class, and I can let everyone else go home. So, all right. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time in your word. God, even if we don't understand exactly everything, or, you know, just have a perfect picture in our heads of how everything at the beginning of time happened, I just pray you would help us to at least take the truth of your word, maybe some of the bigger concepts that we do know and we see revealing your truth for our lives. And Lord, I just pray you would help us to continue to consider your word, continue to dig deep into it so that we can know you better in our place within your creation. So Lord, we thank you. Pray you bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.